Greetings to all, and welcome back. We appreciate you being here today. We want to tell you a brand new story. Let's get started. A few years ago, if you had asked me, I would have said that I was really fortunate. I had a stable career, a home over my head, a basic but nice existence, and most significantly, a woman I loved. Because I wanted to, not because I had to. I worked 2 jobs. I thought it was important to put in a lot of effort, save money, and create a future for us. Even though I was exhausted, I didn't gripe. I was acting in our best interests and for the life we were meant to lead together. We had a small yet cozy house. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was sufficient. I believed I had all a man could desire. A wife who grinned at me as if I were her entire universe. After a long shift, my partner waited for me to return home. Someone who would message me throughout the day to let me know she was missing me, advising me to look for myself, declaring her love for me. I trusted her. I had faith in her. You see, you don't question someone you love. You don't sit about questioning whether they're telling the truth or not. You simply have faith. And I did just that. Every grin, every I love you, every word. I believed it all. However, things are not always as they seem. I was not an exception to the rule that love may blind you. I believed that my marriage was ideal. I believed my wife to be faithful. However, what is the reality? The reality was rather different. And I would awaken one day to a reality I had never anticipated. I had just returned home from work on this typical evening, my body aching from yet another long shift. I was anticipating a shower, a supper, and possibly a few hours of sleep before my next shift as the sun was lowering and bathing the neighborhood in a warm glow. My neighbor yelled out to me at that moment. Let me clarify now. No one of my neighbors and I had a close relationship. Yes, I did exchange nods, perhaps a brief one asking how things were doing, but only after I got past them. No lengthy discussions, no friendships, just the courteous, aloof acknowledgement you offer to those who live close to you. I wasn't sure what to anticipate when this elderly man, who was most likely in his late 50s and often sat on his porch looking out at the street, waved for me to come over. I approached him while dabbing at my perspiration. He appeared uncomfortable. He seemed to be checking to make sure no one else was listening as his eyes darted around. He began to shift in his seat and said, "Hey, look, I don't mean to cause trouble. I've seen something, albeit it might not be my concern. While you're at work, your wife has been bringing a man home." I blinked. Then I burst out laughing. More than anything else, it was disbelief. A male? I shook my head and repeated, "No, it's most likely just a relative if she brought someone home. It might be your cousin." He was not amused. He was not even grinning. He simply gave me an inexplicable look. "I don't think so," he said. "I've had a couple encounters with him. The same individual. And it always happens when you're not there." The air around me felt suddenly heavier as I stood there. I nearly allowed his remarks affect me for a moment. Nearly. However, this was absurd. My wife wouldn't do that. She was the one who kissed me every morning before I left for work, the one who texted me during the day to remind me to eat. I smirked and waved him away. "I truly appreciate your thoughtfulness. You must be wrong, though." After he paused as if he wanted to add more, he simply nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Perhaps I am." I shook my head and left. I made an effort to shake it off. Yes, I did. My neighbor's words kept coming back to me as I laid in bed that night. The thought persisted despite my best efforts to ignore it. I convinced myself that everything had a rational explanation. Perhaps it was a friend from work, a family member, or an innocent bystander. However, despite my efforts to persuade myself, the thought persisted. I wanted to prove to myself that she wasn't guilty, therefore I needed to know, not because I believed she was. I set up these little cameras with memory cards to store their film the following day while she was out conducting errands. I didn't want to waste my money on anything that was overly costly. I thought she wouldn't notice. I only did it in a few spots. I required evidence that my neighbor was mistaken and that my wife was who I thought she was. My hands were trembling a little as I worked on the last one. I detested having to think about this at all. However, it felt necessary at the same time. What harm could it do if she wasn't doing anything wrong? And I needed to know if she was. So I waited. It took me several days to ultimately listen to the tapes. I had nearly persuaded myself that I would not discover anything, that the cameras had been pointless, and that I had unnecessarily let the words of a stranger to shock me. I took a seat in front of my laptop and started going through the files. The tape from the first few days was typical. It showed my wife going about the house, watching TV, and preparing dinner. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary. A feeling of relaxation washed over me. I should remove these and put this incident out of my mind. I chose to watch the remainder, though. I saw it at that moment. My spouse is grinning while pouring 2 glasses of wine in our living room. A man entered who I had never seen before. He had no family. He wasn't a companion. He was unknown. It was clear from the way my wife greeted him. They were at ease with one another. They moved to the couch and sat uncomfortably close, and I continued to watch. He put his arm around her waist and leaned in to kiss her. My chest constricted. Then they got up and headed upstairs while holding hands. To our sleeping quarters. My breath caught. I had a dry throat. I didn't turn away, though. I saw them vanish into the room my wife and I had occupied for years. I knew exactly what was going on behind the closed door and the empty corridor as I gazed at it. I felt like I was being punched in the stomach by the information. The man eventually emerged in my bathrobe, which I always wore after taking a shower in the morning. In order to breathe, I had to stop watching the video and close my eyes. I felt empty as I sat there for a while. I had the option to confront her. I could have questioned her about it, the reason behind her actions, the reason behind her deception. Why give her the satisfaction of justifying why she had allowed another man into our house? I was aware of the outcome. She would say all the proper things, cry and plead, lie, and twist the truth. She would assure me that she still loved me, that it was an error, and that it had no significance. She might even try to make me feel worse, say that I was too preoccupied with my work to give her the attention she needed, and that I was to blame for her actions. No, I wouldn't allow her to do that. I wouldn't respond to her in any way. I decided to do something instead. Not to argue, not to engage in combat, not to let her know that I knew anything at all. So I got to work making plans. I knew I had to do it correctly once I made the decision to go. It wasn't enough to simply leave. I have to entirely obliterate myself. No loose ends. There's no way she can find me. I started saving every spare cent for my 2 jobs as my first action. Moving money around wouldn't appear odd because I had always been in charge of our finances. I reduced my expenditures, avoided pointless purchases, and made sure to save as much money as possible. My spouse didn't notice. She was too preoccupied. She was too engrossed in her own universe to notice what was happening. I then created a private account with one of these international payment systems. I was aware that alarms would sound if I depleted our joint account all at once. I therefore began out tiny. Here are a few hundred. There are many hundred. Transfers should be made gradually to avoid suspicion. I gradually transfer my portion of our savings to the new account so that I wouldn't be leaving empty-handed. Next were the credit cards. I knew I had to break the connection after we exchanged a few. I informed her that I wanted to combine our accounts for easier management and that I was changing banks. As long as she could get what she needed, she hardly paid any attention. The specifics didn't matter to her. In order to prevent her from tracking my whereabouts through financial transactions while I was away, I closed them down one by one. The last step was to quit my jobs. In order to avoid anyone having any motive to search for me later, I made sure to leave on good terms when I submitted my resignation in a discreet manner. I informed my manager that I was leaving for a better opportunity in another place. My co-workers shook my hand, sent me best wishes, and advised me to stay in contact. They were unaware that they would never hear from me again once I left that office. Furthermore, my wife was totally unaware of it all. At the same time, she continued to see him, bring him into our house, and use our bed for purposes it was never intended for. I took my final seat in our living room the night before I went. I took one last look around, taking in everything. I no longer call this place home. I was treated like an idiot there. I grabbed my wedding ring, the plain gold band that had stood for devotion, love, and a never-fulfilled promise. Before throwing it away, I felt its weight one more time as I rolled it between my fingers. I was heading somewhere where I didn't need it. My luggage swung over my shoulder as I stood at the entrance at 4:30 a.m. Without hesitation, no second thoughts. With a soft click, the door closed behind me as I twisted the handle and went outside. I didn't turn around. Not once. I was gone by the time the light came up. I eventually learned how it all turned out for her, even though I was unaware of it at the time. How she discovered the bed next to her was empty when she woke up one morning. She probably didn't give it much thought at first. However, the terrible feeling began to set in when she proceeded around the home expecting to find me in the shower or getting ready. I learned that she called my name as she passed through the house, becoming increasingly agitated as the silence drew on. I wasn't there, but she most likely looked in the typical spots. My belongings were also missing. My jacket was gone, my boots were gone, and there were no keys in the place I always kept them at the entrance. My phone was unanswered when she called. It immediately went to voicemail. Nothing has changed after a couple more calls. She called my workplace in a panic, only to be informed that I had resigned last week. She must have realized then that something was wrong. I had vanished in non-existence. Then the last blow was delivered. Our joint account had been depleted when she hurried to the bank. There wasn't much left when she finally found it out. She discovered I hadn't simply left when the bank finally informed her the truth. I had fully removed myself from her life. I had no idea how long she had been looking for me. I had no idea how desperate she was or how far she would go to find me. But I discovered the specifics over time. She spent money she most likely couldn't afford, hired a private investigator, and threw herself into a search for someone who had previously ensured that no evidence was found. She became increasingly aware of how meticulously I had arranged my departure the harder she looked. Everything I did was intentional. Every action was planned. I also heard over time that she was overwhelmed by regret. She was unable to make amends, provide an explanation, or even ask for pardon. None of that was at all possible. The only one she could blame was herself. The fact that she would never be able to make up for what she had done may have been the hardest aspect of it. I had already moved on while she was looking. I was able to get away from everything that had connected me to the past and the country. I made my home on a Caribbean island where nobody recognized who I was. Additionally, life moved at a slower, quieter pace. There, I discovered tranquility, which I was unaware I was lacking. I initially lived alone and relished the seclusion. I ultimately found someone, but the silence became my haven. She was different from the others. Above all, she respected me for who I was, and she was kind and understanding. I experienced the simplicity, honesty, and sincerity that define true love. Together, we established a mutually respectful existence. And I knew I had made the right choice when our daughter was born. This was the future I deserved, the family I had always dreamed of, and the family I believed I would never have again. And the old life was gone forever. She didn't find me for years. I wasn't really hiding anymore. I had moved on at that point and created something fresh and genuine. My life in the Caribbean had turned into everything that my previous existence had not been. Tranquil, truthful, and unburdened by betrayal. Now I had a kid who was everything to me, a wife who genuinely loved me, and a family. I was no longer dwelling on the past. It could no longer control me. Until it knocked one day. She spotted me first, not the other way around. Later on, I found out that she eventually discovered me somehow. She took a plane in my new house. Then she noticed me. On a typical day, I was standing outside of the market, holding my daughter's hand while she excitedly tugged at me and pointed to something she desired. My history finally came up with me at that point. She must have watched and taken in what she was seeing. She had not anticipated this. Perhaps she assumed that I would still be hurt, resentful, and burdened by what she had done to me. Perhaps she believed that I had been unable to move on and had been constantly watching me. Rather, she discovered me content, whole, and unaffected by the suffering she had left behind. My past was there, staring back at me. Even though she had spent years searching and gone this far, she seemed unsure of what to do now that she was in front of me. She moved in closer. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her voice was barely above a breath as she whispered my name. A last-ditch effort to find something that still held us together. A plea. Because she was just that, I cocked my head slightly and studied her as if she were a stranger. She briefly looked into my face, searching for emotion, recognition, or a sign that I was still remembered or that I cared, but all she saw was nothingness. I allowed the silence to linger between us so that the reality could set in. Then I finally said something. "I apologize. Am I familiar with you?" The word struck her more forcefully than any yell, charge, or furious altercation could. When she blinked, I noticed something in her eyes that I had never noticed before. Luz. I didn't hold off till she answered. I didn't give her an opportunity to cry, to explain, or to plead. I just spun around. I never turned around after taking my daughter's hand and leaving. I experienced nothing but tranquility as I left, the kind of calm that results from realizing that the past no longer controls you. I once believed that the betrayal would haunt me for the rest of my life and that I would never recover. With a single decision, her betrayal had destroyed everything we had previously shared, including years of love, trust, and memories. However, I had no desire to reopen that chapter because it was closed and in the past. Certain betrayals should only be forgotten, not forgiven. I'd like to hear from you now. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have gone up against her? Would you have departed in my manner? Or would you have taken a different approach? Please share this tale with someone who needs to hear it and let me know in the comments. Perhaps they'll discover the solution they've been seeking.